So hello, everyone. It's good to see you all here. I'm Max. I work for Mozilla. And we're here today to talk about recommender systems and the Digital Services Act. I think we all have a rough understanding of the different types of harmful content on online platforms that we all have encountered, probably even more so if you don't look like me, if you're a woman, if you're a person of color. And we all have a rough idea of the various impacts this can have, both on individuals, but also more broadly on things like public health, the discourse around climate change, the integrity of civic and democratic processes. So we've long been having discussions about content moderation. So the question of what stays up on a platform, what gets taken down, all the stuff that drives Elon Musk crazy. But I think in the past couple of years, we've seen a broadening of this discussion to also focus on content recommendations. So the algorithmic systems that determine what goes viral and what doesn't, and that sort of assemble our bespoke little online realities when we open an app like TikTok or Twitter or Instagram. And I think it's also important to note that these types of systems aren't used just on social media, right? If you stream music, if you stream movies, if you shop online, you've all encountered these types of systems. It's not just a social media thing. And these systems, recommender systems, have also been around for a long time. This is not a recent technological innovation. They have been in use for years and years and years. The one thing that's changed now is that suddenly there's regulation, and regulation that's specific to recommender systems. And by that, I mean the Digital Services Act in the EU, of course. So for those not super familiar with the DSA, I'll provide a very brief overview of what the DSA actually says about recommender systems and what types of provisions it entails. And I'll start maybe with a very condensed definition of the DSA on recommender systems, which says that recommender systems are automated systems used by platforms to suggest or prioritize information in its interface, including following search queries. And there's a bunch of different provisions and obligations that relate to these systems in the DSA. I think most notably, there's Article 27 and Article 38. Article 27 applies to all online platforms and provides for like a rough baseline of user-facing transparency around recommender systems, for example, with regard to the main parameters used in a recommender system, and also the options that users have to modify these parameters. Article 38 applies to very large online platforms and mandates these platforms to offer one recommender system that's not based on profiling within the meaning of the GDPR. And then there's a bunch of other obligations and provisions that sort of touch on recommender systems. So Article 34 and 35 are about risk assessment and mitigation for platforms to sort of assess and mitigate risks that are related to a platform's recommender system. We have Article 37, which mandates independent audits of platforms' compliance with the DSA, including with the recommender system specific provisions. And then finally, we have Article 40 which mandates data access for researchers who want to study recommender systems and the systemic risks that can stem from them. Obviously, this is a lot. There's a lot to unpack here. And I know we all just had lunch. This is a very dimly lit room on the third day of a conference. And now there's a guy up front who's citing articles from the Digital Services Act to you. But I can assure you that this will get much more fun once the other people on the panel start speaking. And we have a great panel here for you. I'll start right to my left with Professor Francesco Ricci. Francesco is a professor of computer science at the Free University of Bozen-Bolzano, where he researches recommender systems, user modeling, machine learning, and applications to travel and tourism. We have Jesse McCrosky, head of sustainability and social change, and a principal data scientist at Thoughtworks Finland, which is a consultancy and also a dear former colleague of mine at Mozilla. We have Xabier Lareo, who is head of the technology monitoring and foresight sector at the European Data Protection Supervisor, which he joined in 2017. And then finally, we have Dr. Kati Meßmer. Kati is a sociologist and project director for the project Auditing of Recommender Systems at the Berlin-based think tank Stiftung Neue, Verantwortung, or as people who don't speak German know it, SNV. So I think we'll start with sort of like trying to unpack all this and interpret these provisions that I was just talking about to see what the challenges with implementation are. And I think my first question is for Kati. So Kati, how are we going to actually evaluate the implementation of these provisions? Are we really prepared to audit them effectively?
That's a good question. We already had this discussion over lunch, and I would say we at the SNB, we already try to audit from the outside and do some scraping. But actually, it's a difficult question. And at first, maybe let me unpack it a little bit further, who we talk about when we say we, because I see at least 3 different parties in this auditing process. The first one, you already mentioned it, is the paragraph 37 in the DSA, and we talk about second-party compliance audits here. Then we have, of course, the research and civil society community, and we will hopefully have the ability to get some data access. And then we also have the regulators like the Commission, the board, and so on. But and also the digital services coordinators. And I would say we have, for each of these parties, we have a different challenge here. So at SNV, we have talked a lot to the accounting firms who are the actual candidates for the compliance audits. And besides the fact that I feel like they are really lacking data science expertise, their main concern is that they have to deal with like sociological and normative concepts. For example, they have to have concepts about what actually disinformation is and have to make definitions about that. And I'm really interested how they are going to address that problem. Then for the regulators, I see also mainly lack of expertise and also lack of resources and stuff here. And from the outside right now, I don't know how you experience it here in the room, but from the outside right now, it looks a little bit like a mess to me, what is happening right now. And then this leads me also to the last point here. For us as researchers and civil society, maybe our biggest challenge right now is that we have to be very patient because we have to wait for the delegated act on data access before we can effectively test and evaluate our ideas and hypotheses. And then there is also another challenge for us, for example, at the SNV as a smaller organization, if you're able to do the vetting process and provide all the safeguards. So right now, I really feel like we're lagging behind the developments of the platforms, and we have to wait for the provisions to be implemented. And before that, I'm sorry to say we can try to audit from the outside, but actually we can't right now.
Thank you. Moving to you, Xabier. You work for the EDPS, so surprise, you think a lot about how to uphold data protection in the EU. So for you, how do the DSA and the GDPR interact in this context? And do you think the DSA will advance data protection with these provisions?
Okay, I think that DSA and the GDPR have pursue different but complementary objectives. Okay, the DSA is more focused on societal risks, like the spread of misinformation or illegal content, while the GDPR is more focused on individual data protection rights. However, I think that the overlap it's unavoidable because recommender systems work basically on personal data, on profiles of users. So, as you mentioned before, the DSA has has provisions like 27 and 38 that aim to provide more information to users about how their data are processed and more control or certain control. We can talk about this later on. To the users, but let's go little by little on the GDPR. The GDPR requires data controllers to inform data subjects about the use of automatic decision-making systems, and recommender systems are an example of those. Okay, so GDPR requires you to give meaningful information about the logic involved, whatever that means, and of the consequences of the processing. Okay, so to which extent is it's the DSA helping in this endeavor of providing this information? The DSA asks the online platforms, okay, and the search engines to provide the parameters that are the main parameters that are used by the recommender systems, and the options, okay, and the options to modify those parameters whenever they are those options. Apart from that, the DSA is also asking the online platforms, okay, that use recommender systems to inform about why the decisions are taken. So when you are served one content or when you are suggested some element of information, why the decision, how the decision was taken. So providing the criteria and the relevance, the relative importance of the parameters that were used to take that decision. Does that amount to meaningful information of the logic involved in the sense of the GDPR? I'll give you my own view on this, and I think that it does not, or at least it does not completely. Why? Because my understanding is that what the DSA is providing to users is what we could call local explainability. Local explainability, it's the capacity to explain decisions, specific decisions of an automatic decision-making system. That is, if you are shown an advertisement of a restaurant in Brussels, you are being told that that's because you are located in Brussels and you are labeled as a person in between 20 and 60 years old, for example, and that's it. But what the GDPR requires when your data are collected or when you access your data, when you exercise your access right, is to provide information not on the specific decision each and every time a decision is taken, but on the general level. And that's what is called global explainability. And that's why I think that it helps, but it doesn't completely cover it, okay? Apart from that, I think that Article 38, which is providing some options to control the data and to control the processing of the data, it's also allowing you to a certain extent to control the data quality, but it's not covered. It only covers the very large online providers and the very large search engines. So I think that it's not so much helpful on that regard, and I think that it's also missing many other data subject rights, like for example the portability right and some others. But I mean, it's totally reasonable that the DSA is not covering completely the data protection regulation because they have different names.
Thank you very much. Jesse, we already talked about we are already talking about the overlap between the DSA and the GDPR, and as we already mentioned, there's a provision in the DSA that talks about recommender systems not based on profiling. So you're a data scientist. From a technical perspective, how do you interpret the role of profiling in all of this? And maybe also more generally of the data that platforms collect to inform recommendations.
Yeah, thanks, Max. If we look at the status quo among the VLOPs and most other platforms, to be honest, they're working mostly with what we would call behavioral data. So if you're thinking about social media, what are you clicking on? How long are you watching a video? Or even if you're scrolling through a feed, where do you slow down your scrolling because something catches your attention? That sort of thing. So this is behavioral data or implicit feedback, which we also like to call it, and we'll talk about the contrast with that in a minute. And I think it's nice that I follow Xabier and his discussion about the interaction between the DSA and the GDPR, because I think there's really important kind of data protection implications here. This is something that a lot of people know, but not everybody. So I'm just going to make it really clear that when you have adequately rich data, especially behavioral data, you know a lot about a person. And so there's not a lot of public research on this behavioral data, but there were a couple of papers published, and this is like 10 years ago now or something like that, showing that if you know somebody's Facebook likes or their location check-ins on whatever, that you can infer all sorts of sensitive characteristics like their sexual orientation, their political orientation, membership in different ethnic groups, all sorts of things like that. So when you're using this behavioral data, you are inescapably inferring all this very sensitive personal information. And I think an important thing to notice is that the platforms don't necessarily even know that they know this. So when we look at explainability, when we look about requirements to say what features are being used, the platform knows that they have your likes or whatever. They might not know that they know your sexual orientation. But it's the same thing that if I said, only people with long hair can be in this room, that's not going to split perfectly by gender, of course, but I'm going to be discriminating based on gender without needing to know people's gender. It's the same thing. So if you want to have a non-profiling recommender, we need to get away from this behavioral data. And that's why I also like to refer to it as implicit feedback. So this is feedback that you're not really intending to give the platform necessarily. And the contrast there, hopefully obviously, is explicit feedback. So this is information that you are choosing to provide to the platform. I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but this is very reasonable. This is something that the platforms can do, and I'm sure they can make all sorts of arguments about why it's difficult. And when it comes down to it, I think most of the challenges are really design challenges. And how do you create a user experience on a platform in which the users are elicited to provide feedback that can be used for targeting without increasing friction to the point that the platform is unusable? I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. So Francesco, you have done research on this for a while now, and you have published extensively about recommender systems and probably know the academic computer science community in this area better than anyone else on the panel. So how has this topic been discussed in the research community from your perspective? And are the questions we're discussing here really new questions?
Oh, too many. Okay, thank you for the question. It's interesting for me to see a completely different group of people with different assumptions and different beliefs. So, for instance, if I have to ask to you, how many of you think that personalization is good? So raise your hand if you think that personalization is good. How many of you think that is bad? I'd say half and half, no? So one thing that I would say immediately is that personalization is not against fairness. So there was a discussion this morning about personalization and fairness. Actually, if you don't do personalization, you cannot achieve fairness, because typically all the systems that are not personalized, they are based on aggregated data about the user behaviors, are typically the most biased system that you can build. So the only way to generate something that is really useful for the user and even unbiased is to use personalization. So that's something that we have to understand. So the problem is not that we should not do personalization, but how we use personalization in performing our recommendation services. The other big aspect that maybe it's interesting to discuss here is that nowadays the systems that are built are very, very complex. So complex that even 1 year person, let's say, studying the system that a big company like Netflix is using cannot understand after 1 year how it really works. So you have to imagine these are really, really complex black boxes that nobody can really understand exactly how they behave. So the point of, let's say, providing explanations and providing, let's say, description of how it works has been approached in a completely different way by the researchers. So, for instance, the models that are used to generate recommendations are completely different from the models that are used in order to explain a recommendation. So they are completely different things. So one model is used for generating recommendation, and another one is personalized to give to each user a personalized explanation, but without taking into account how this has been generated. So it could be very, very difficult to augment the transparency of the system with this type of research. Then maybe if I can add some few comments about this recommended system without profiling. As I said already, there is a risk that we build a recommended system that are even more biased compared to those that we can build by using personal data. But there are some approaches that have tried to work in this direction. I think that the most interesting ones are those that are session-based. You all know that your behavioral data can accumulated by the system and used in the future to generate recommendations. But there are some other approaches that are just using the data that you are releasing during the session and are forgetting about that when you close your session. These are, let's say, potential solutions, are typically contextualized and not personalized, so based on the context of the interactions and based on only the data that you provided during the interaction. This could be more interesting, could have a development, and probably will be conversational, so they will exploit now the big research on large language models and conversational systems.
Thank you very much. So maybe we just discussed sort of like what the DSA actually means and what these different provisions might mean, but maybe looking toward the future, I want to ask what you all sort of expect to happen now that the DSA is being implemented. And maybe again to you, Francesco, so from your experience working on this, how do you expect this to change the sort of like the recommender ecosystem, both economically and as a field of study? And how will companies be impacted by this?
Oh, I'm not an economic expert, but I think that the big players will not have any problem to develop a new recommendation technology which are not using personalizations. Actually, this is also, it's only a possibility for the user to opt out from the personalization. I'm pretty sure that most of the user will opt in, will still be involved in these technologies. But for sure, I think that there will a growth of companies that will perform specific testing and auditing for assessing that recommended system that are used, maybe not in the big players platforms, but in say medium and low level platforms are compliant with this type of requirements. So there will be a new wave of testing technologies that will be developed. So for instance, an important aspect that it's worth to discuss is how we now test these systems. So we normally test by using data that have been acquired and by rerunning recommendations and checking whether the system is performing well with respect to the historical data. But the most important thing is really to understand how the system will behave in the long term with new data. So this type of longitudinal analysis, I think, could be developed by new technologies and by new companies that will do that because now they have to monitor the effect of the recommended system.
Thank you. Kati, maybe to you, we sort of now covered the system and the ecosystem perspective, but I also want to talk about the user perspective for a bit, maybe. So you've done a lot of work on media literacy, for example, previously, and obviously on recommender systems. So maybe the question to you, how do you think this will and should change users' experience on these platforms? And what do you think is maybe also desirable in this context, if there's even consensus around this or any form of that?
Maybe I start with your last question first, if there is consensus, because I think we don't have a consensus yet. That's maybe also a problem we have here, because since, as you already mentioned, we're lacking the data, we don't know too much about the user's experience. So we all know here, and this was also a topic of different panels here on the CPDP is that there is this huge imbalance between what the platforms know about their users' behavior, and they do all the A/B testing, and we as researchers and also as policy experts, we are lacking that kind of specific expertise. And this brings me to the first question, if the user's experience is going to change. And I don't know if it really changes so much, because you both mentioned recommender systems not based on profiling, but actually there are already recommender systems in place where I can choose between a profiling-based recommender systems and a maybe more based on explicit feedback or more based on my social graph recommender system. And this is, for example, the case on TikTok, on Twitter, and also on Facebook. So there are already these options. But and I found that really interesting. Yoel Roth just stated, he is a former head of trust and safety at Twitter, and he just stated that they experienced at Twitter that most of the people don't use the chronological timeline. And he also mentioned that more than 95% of people didn't even touch the safe search option. And for me, this aligns with my research I did at the SNV, for example, that we learned that people don't use information queues. People are not interested in having more options and more information. This is something we as experts here, as policy experts, and also as very literate and well-educated people, we ask for these options. But even I, in my daily life, I don't use these options. So for me, one really interesting or important point here is more options, more information will not solve the problem. So we should not ask for more of that, but more talk about what kind of default settings we need here. And this is something maybe you're well aware of from the GDPR discussions about consent forms and dark patterns. So yeah, maybe you want to add something here as well. Sorry for moderating, Max.
That's perfectly fine.
Thank you for the question, because I do think that more information and more control is necessary. But when I was talking about the overlap in between the GDPR and the DSA, I forgot about data protection by design and by default. Yes, of course. I mean, the problem for me impartially is that there is not enough quality information, that there is not enough user control, and that platforms are not applying data protection by default on a consistent way. And that's why so many dark patterns are out in the internet. I mean, if you take by default, I mean, you said before that not many people are using in Twitter the chronological order. But what is the default on Twitter? I'm not a Twitter user, I must confess.
The default is the profiling.
Okay. I mean, let's try setting in Twitter the chronological by default, and let's see if there are many people, like 90% of the people, switching to another. But I mean, for me, it should be clear. I mean, you should process the lower amount of personal data that you should need, and profiling is processing of personal data. So, if you are forced, because you are a very large online platform, to use a non-profiled option, then you should start by that. And if you can, I mean, if you want, when a user is registering, then you can offer the user the possibility, hey, look, I have this option of having a profiled content suggestion or recommender system. It will help you, because please note that in your chronological order you have this and these issues, and in this other way I could give you this and that. But that implies consumer choice or user choice, then implies transparent information, because you want to convince people to change to your profiling content moderator, and not the other way around. So I think that's very relevant.
Thank you. And actually, Kati asked pretty much the question I was going to ask anyway, so you did my job very well. Maybe just to sort of throw in an observation, because you already raised it, Kati. I think it's interesting to see that we're talking so much about user control at a moment where so many platforms deliberately move away from it, right? Because so many companies now offer feeds where it doesn't even matter anymore whether you follow someone or whether you're friends with someone. You just sort of like start, and then they measure and they observe, and then they determine what you want to see. But maybe with that question turning to you, Jesse, from your perspective, in terms of offering more control to users, is that maybe an anachronism? Or is that something we should still continue to think about? And if so, what could platforms feasibly offer here?
Max knows how to ask a question that I like, so thank you for that. I'm going to respectfully disagree with my fellow panelist, and I think it's true that the platforms are offering alternative feeds, specifically chronologically or based on your following graph or whatever else. But I don't think I've seen a major platform that's offering a feed based on explicit feedback or that's based on user control. So I think that this is something that still is in need of further exploration. I'll reference some work I've done with Mozilla. And I have to say too, Max, that when you referred to me as your ex-Mozilla colleague, I had to hide the tears so the audience wouldn't see. I'm still very actively working with Mozilla as a consultant. I'm just not an employee there anymore. But recently, with Mozilla, we conducted a study on user controls on YouTube. And I won't rehash the findings. You can find them online easily. But very briefly, we found the user controls don't work very well, and also that they're not really designed to be used. So having worked in the industry, I know at Google, if they want people to press a button, they can create a UX that's going to get people to press that button. So when YouTube is crying that oh, nobody uses our user controls, we're so sad, we wish we could pay attention to these signals, but we can't. I mean, there's really crocodile tears. So I think that the interesting opportunity here with a non-profiling recommender is how do we create experiences where user control can really be meaningful, where we can really work with the users to produce an experience. And I think that interests can align here. I think that there's some questions about the engagement model, producing a lot of advertising revenue and everything, but we really can create better products if we better understand what users want. The other thing I'll say is that there are a lot of interesting trade-offs that happen behind the scenes in these recommender systems. I refer to these as knobs, and you can turn them one way or the other, and the platforms are setting these knobs in the dark with no concern for what their users want or what's actually good for society. So a simple example is if they have a profiler that's determining if content is violating their policies, it's hate speech, whatever. I mean, there's going to be some, kind of gray zone. So they're going to have to make some trade-off. Do we want to be really careful to suppress anything that could even possibly be hate speech, or do we want to be, a little bit more permissive, make sure we're not censoring anything unnecessarily, and let a little bit of stuff get through. And so I don't think it's fair to claim that the same setting is right for every user. And I think there are vulnerable populations for which you want a very strict setting, where maybe you're going to lose some innocent content in the process, but you're going to make sure that you're not going to see anything that's triggering for that individual. Whereas other individuals that are more robust or for whatever reason are not as concerned about that sorts of content can make that choice. So exposing these sorts of trade-offs to users, I think it's really important. As well, there can be really great experiences where at times you might want content that's very aligned with your profile. You want things that you're going to like. And other times you might be interested in exploring more, wider interests. And of course, there's some UX elements on these sites. There's different tabs, whatever, that start to approach this. I think there's a lot more that can be done. What I would say is that actually understanding what people want, not just what they'll click on or what they'll watch, is a very challenging data science and psychological, psychometric problem, but it's not impossible. And I think with the proper incentives, which I'm hoping the DSA can provide, I think the platforms can do a much better job, and we can actually have some very good innovation in the space.
Thank you. And on that topic, maybe a brief question to Francesco, because as I mentioned at the beginning, recommender systems aren't only used in social media and on platforms like YouTube, which I think we're talking about a lot here. But the provisions that we're talking about, they also apply to platforms in other sectors, right? To e-commerce, for example. And as I mentioned when I introduced you, you also work on applications in other sectors, for example, in travel and tourism. So I was wondering, do you have any experience with explicit feedback mechanisms like the ones that Jesse just talked about, or what's your view?
But my opinion is that say the idea of recommender systems that are controllable is something which is not new. So since 10 years we have been developing a system that are more interactive, where the user can say, give me something more, let's say, related to this and not related to that, or show me more content or less content. And a lot of, let's say, tools and techniques have been developed in the past in order to provide this type of interactions. But as the other panelists have said, it's actually then when the companies have introduced these technologies, the reactions of the customer, of the user, was very, very cold. So they didn't use it, and they consider this type of functionality complex, too complex. So my impression is that we have to bridge this gap. So from one side, the desire to make the system more controllable, and from the other side, how to make the system more controllable, easy for the users. That's the big issue. My impression is that now we are, let's say, everybody is testing new types of artificial intelligence that is based on natural language-based conversations. I think this will provide probably a tool to better interact with these complex systems by making possible for the user to explicit these constraints in a natural and simple way. While before you had to access menus and clicks and that are typically obscure and difficult to understand. So this could change the scenario for sure. That's my impression on this explicit feedback. Also, the explicit feedback could improve, could be used even more, and could grow because it would be easier for the user to enter this explicit feedback and also to understand how this feedback is really exploited by the system.
Thank you very much. So for this last question, we initially intended this to be a lightning round because we thought we had much less time than we actually do. So I'm going to say a sentence that no moderator should ever say. Take your time when you respond to this. Really think it through. But let's imagine, so we have the DSA, we have the GDPR, but let's also imagine that you have a magic wand and you can magic into existence some change or something you want to see in the recommender systems world. What would that be? So what's at the top of your wish list for this? And you raise your hand, so that means you really have a big wish.
So, there is a dream in some sense that I have, but I think many people that are developing recommender system they have. Is really to build a recommender system where the providers has no personal data about you. So where the recommender system is not on the server side, but is on the client side, okay? So imagine that you have your recommender system or your mobile phone, but this recommender system is not, let's say, providing any of your personal data to the server. This type of dream to have this distributed system that are like, let's say, personal agents that are working for you, I think now it could also become a reality. Also because we have a new, let's say, techniques, encryption techniques. So, for instance, we have homomorphic encryption, and we can build a recommender system where the client is encrypting the personal data that is sending to the server. The server is generating recommendations without having access to the real personal data and sending back the recommendation encrypted that can be decrypted by the client in order to read the recommendation. So this could be in some sense done without the server to know personal data, and also the client without knowing what are let's say, the global aggregated data about other users that are stored in the server. So I imagine this type of solutions where the privacy is preserved by technological solutions, and we do not have to release all this behavioral or explicit preference data for the system to build reliable and effective recommendations.
Okay, so privacy-preserving recommendations are the computer scientist's dream. What is the sociologist's dream, Kati? What's the data protection regulator's dream, Xabier?
Okay, I also have a wish list. first I would go. I would test the wand and ask for a very easy thing, like, okay, please move the information from the terms of service, that legal document that nobody who is not a privacy geek or a lawyer ever reads, and take the information to where the users might actually use it. So, for example, to the place where you have the controls over your profile, or at least to the top of the page, so you can easily access that information. So that's the first test with the wand. And if it works, then I would become more bold. I would become more courageous, and then I would say, like, okay, let's go for more difficult stuff. Now, why don't we give information of people about the picture that the platforms have about them? Because the information, the content that we are served by online platforms is based on a kind of, I wouldn't say digital twin, but it's a kind of a digital twin that they have about you. That means that you have a lot of labels that are attached to you. And I know that some online platforms are already showing you, I don't know if all or some of these labels, but I think that some people will be very happy to be aware of what are the labels that are attached to them. So, because they might be very happy about these labels, or they might not be very happy at all. So they might say, I'm sorry, you are labeling me as, let's say, a football fan, which I'm not. I want you to correct this data because this inference of my data is wrong. And this data quality, this is a problem with data quality. I mean, I don't want to say infringement, but and if you don't have this view, and I know that many people will not go into this view, but if you don't have this view, there is no way in which, you can be aware of how much these online platforms know about you, because that's also a side effect of having this view. Okay, so requiring this view is if you go to a site and you think that they have like 3 or 4 elements, like when they show you in the example of the restaurant. Okay, I'm showing you this advertisement about a Brussels restaurant because you are close by and you seem to be of certain age, but you think that they have like 4, 5, maybe 10 information or labels about you, and then you see a list of 300 and you become super scared. And then it's like, oh, something's wrong. And this awareness, I think it would help people to know better how the internet works, or how some online platform works. And this also would help the online platforms to become more balanced and say, okay, maybe I don't need so much labels, or maybe I need to be more careful about the labels because my users are not so happy about me having so many labels. So that's my wish list.
Thank you. And I think the first point about moving information from the terms and conditions to another place reminded me of a session this morning hosted by Meta about fairness in personalization, where one of the panelists started her intervention by saying, as anyone who reads the terms and condition knows, which is usually not how a good argument starts, and which is also how you know that it's a lawyer speaking. But just that as a brief sidebar. But I'm going to turn it to you, Kati, for your wish list.
After I heard this side note and your inputs, of course, I have to say on top of my wish list is the end of inequality. Especially when it comes to education, because, and this leads me to the point I already mentioned, on top of my wish list are good default settings. Because, and as a sociologist, I have to point to the problem first. The problem is what we learned over the last days here, especially on a panel on dark patterns, is who is vulnerable to deceptive design. And usually it's people who are already disadvantaged. So if we have more user control, more user options, it will be people, especially children, very old people. And I also learned very old people are already people over 40 who are vulnerable to deceptive design, so be prepared. Then it's especially people with low income, low education, these are the people vulnerable. And if we don't think about these people and giving them proper default setting, then we don't address the actual problem. And this leads me to a second point here, and I already mentioned it before as well, is on top of my wish list as a researcher is I wanna, and it's really, it's like a wish list. It doesn't have to be realistic, right? Okay, perfect. Then I want to see A/B testing data. I want to see all the data the platforms gather about user behavior, about how user experience and user behavior changes with different default settings, what users do, which people are really vulnerable to deceptive design. I'd love to see this data to have a good understanding about user experience, and I need this data to make good policy recommendations. If we don't know this data, we are just guessing a lot. But if we want to have a good regulation, we need that data. And to be honest, I hope the delegated acts will help us with that.
Thank you very much. And before I'll turn it over to you for questions, just to give you the cue so you can start queuing at the microphone if you want to. Before I want to ask Jesse, what's the data scientist's dream?
Well, first of all, Kathy, you know the way to a data scientist's heart. I definitely vote for your answer. I think more data, and not just data, but the ability to run experimentation and do interventions, that sort of thing. But you already said that, so I'll say something else. Because Max did something that no moderator should ever do and asked us to take our time, I'm going to do something that no panelist should ever do and start a response with a personal anecdote. So I used to live in San Francisco about 5 years ago, and a few months ago, was back for a conference, the first time back in the area, and now I remember why I left. But anyway, the conference is relevant. This was a conference on social cohesion and technology, and it was really interesting because it brought together the peace building and mediation community with the tech community. And at first, this seemed like a kind of like strange mix, but after the conference, it seemed so obvious, and I really have been advocating for this ever since. We have communities, the peace builders and mediators, that understand how to create spaces for healthy conversations. And in the tech community, we're trying to build, digital public squares, if you go for that framing, whatever, but places where people have conversations. And so this conference really kind of shifted my view. And I think that thinking about how do we design platforms for healthy discourse is a really useful framing. So one person I met there, Jonathan Stray, is a great researcher. He has a survey paper out recently with like 500 other people on human values in recommender systems. And to me, it's like the perfect Lego kit for designing a good recommender system. It's basically thinking about what sorts of human values can we operationalize, what sorts of metrics can we use to build those values into recommender systems. Because if you build a recommender system based on engagement, you're valuing engagement. If you build a recommendation system based on a chronological feed or whatever else, you're valuing recency or volume or whatever else. And those aren't our only choices. So there's a lot of different values that I'm not going to go through them all because I would actually take up the rest of our time and Max would be annoyed. But one of them that I want to mention is this idea of bridge building recommenders. Some other folks that I actually work with a little bit that I met there, Luke Thorburn and Aviv Ovadia, they're doing work on bridge building recommenders. And the idea is that social cohesion can actually be an explicit optimization target for a recommender system. So you can build recommender systems that are designed to create healthier societies. Now this stuff is all very much in the kind of academic sphere, very early research. There's a lot of possible unintended consequences. I don't want to give an unequivocal recommendation that all systems should be using these sorts of methods, but we really need more research here. We really should be playing with this Lego kit and trying to build new recommender systems that work with different sorts of human values. And I think there's a lot of potential there to create better recommender systems and also healthier societies. I'll mention Twitter community notes, formerly Birdwatch. That's actually based on some of these bridge building methods. And Twitter is what Twitter is now, but I think that there was a lot of promise demonstrated there. The basic idea is that you can have crowdsourced content moderation, which typically doesn't work because people just kind of brigade and go after their ideological whatever. But if you try to find points of consensus, if you find notes that get support both from the right and from the left, and both from the northern parts of the world and the southern parts, or whatever else, you find consensus, that's where you can find some value and some truth. So I think this sort of work is something we really should be exploring further, especially with more data and more experimentation from the platforms.
Thank you, Jesse, for giving this very technical discussion a human touch with your anecdote. But I think now is the time for me to stop asking questions and to let you ask. So maybe if you just want to say who you are and if you want to direct your question towards someone specific or to the entire panel, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Max. Thank you for your great questions also. And I'm Alex Zard from Leiden University. I research online behavioral advertising. And,
Could you speak up a little, because it's very noisy behind us? Sorry.
I see. Is this better? It should be better, I think. Can you hear us? Yeah, it's good. Okay. Thank you very much, Max, for your great questions as well. I think you raised a very interesting discussion. I'm Lex Zard from Leiden University. I research online behavioral advertising. My question is directed to Jesse in particular. I think it would be great to have everybody's opinion on this, but particularly Jesse's, because I inferred the answer to this question from what you already said, but I think it's better to ask you directly if this is so. So in the safe and human-friendly online environment that we are imagining here together, do you think there is space for recommender systems that rely on behavioral inferences or not? Because, yeah, I won't speak, just go with it. I was going to explain where I'm coming from, but I think no need, just answer that question. Thank you.
That's a good question. Thanks, Alex. And I don't really know, to be honest. I think that what I would advocate for now would be giving people more choice. But I think that that might actually not be going far enough. I think that if you have, a room full of alcoholics and you here's some wine and here's some water and you can have your choice, you're not going to end up with a good outcome there. I think more research is needed to understand kind of how the dynamics would play out. So I think as a first step, offering that choice would be a way to start to get some data about what is the impact, what sorts of choices are made. But I think that there may be some inherent problems with optimizing for engagement, which is more or less inevitable if you're talking about profiling, that we need to get away from. There was a neat paper at FACT last year, I think it was, prediction as the extraction of discretion. And it kind of wants to make the argument that when you're using predictive machine learning, you are fundamentally taking something away from people. You're trying to predict their behavior and thus trying to coerce their behavior in some sense. And I'm not quite sold, but I think that there's something important there. And this is just something I've been thinking about recently, so I don't have much else to say, to be honest. But I think it definitely does concern me that there is something inherently threatening in the engagement-based optimization that we see with profiling. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
If I may, just a brief comment before you continue on this answer. I think Panopticon Foundation raised this before, and you mentioned it many times that user control is very, very important. That I just want to say this kind of example. For example, I would love to be targeted by surf advertisement or the recommender system that gives me something on surfing or football or things that I choose. But I might be behaving online because of my insecurity, checking hair transplants or some kind of information. I'm not saying that that's truth, but let's assume, right? I go on the web and I'm just checking and I'm insecure. And I don't necessarily want to be targeted by that, right? So maybe some do, but maybe some don't. But that fact that observation of the behavior and inferences versus, the first order preferences, who I choose to be. Right, I think that differentiation is really important, and if you have that kind of environment online which actually exploits your behavioral weaknesses, right? Then, in the end, who are we pushing online users to be? So that's the question. That's where I was coming from when I asked the question, and.
Yeah, no, totally relate. And I have another anecdote, but I'm going to leave the other questioners some time.
If I can add something. So I don't think it's a problem with the behavioral data that the platform is using. So it's like, let's say, the problem is what is the optimization that the platform is doing. So that's what we mentioned. So if you optimize the engagement, you use the data for obtaining that. But even now, recommended system that are using public service media like BBC or other companies like that, they are not optimizing engagement. So for instance, they are optimizing diversity of the recommendation. So you can still use a behavioral data, but with a completely different goal. And the machine learning model is optimizing another, let's say, value.
Hi, Ilya Vasilenko, WeFox. Thank you for this panel. It's very interesting and burning topic. I would like to come back to what Xabier said about platforms exposing our labels to us. To draw an analogy, in e-privacy regulation, there is a proposal that the Chrome browsers or whatever browser would have like a default settings for cookies, so that everybody will cry that we don't see the cookie banner anymore. So that default settings will apply, yeah, if you want or not. Yeah. So in the case of profiling, can you imagine like having a solution which will be in both their directions, so that a person can predefine the profile? Like, let's say I love like cats or dogs, yeah, but I'm not a hamster person, so don't show me the images or whatever, yeah, of hamsters. So that instead of correcting the profile on every single platform again and again, you could define tags and anti-tags, also what you don't like, and the platforms will value for that.
Thank you. That will require a level of standardization that I think it's, I wouldn't say impossible, but really, really complex. I mean, I mean, what I would hope for is for each platform having its own defaults, which are respectful with the data protection by default principle. But not only with that, I mean, you offer different options to your users when they register. You start with a default that it's privacy friendly, let's put it that way, and then you allow them to change that, and then you give them transparency to see, because I mean, even if you provide some labels, some data to the system, many systems are being enriched by the observation and the inference on your behavior. And as long as you are happy with that, and as long as you are happy because you have proper information and proper control about that, I'm good. What I mean is a line saying, would you like to have your behavior being monitored because the system is going to work super good, else who knows? That is not proper information, and that is not going to help you to decide wisely. I would aim for something like, okay, we are going to monitor this kind of behavior if you allow us, because with this we will be able to do this. Okay, and this a one-off. When you register in the system, you are explained and you take your decisions. And if you want to do next, then you have the non-profiled recommender system, and that's it. And if you see that it's not working, then you tweak. That will be my take on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just going to add one point, and I would say that what you describe generally is impossible. What I mean by that, and I'm gonna coin a phrase here. I'll say dark inferences. So if you have adequately rich data about a person, you can infer an endless number of things. So if the platform can say, for example, based on your browsing behavior, we think you like dogs more than cats, the reason they can say that is they have collected from at least some of their users' data, do you prefer dogs or cats, and built a model using their data to predict that label, basically. So they have a model for the dog versus cat liking. But at the same time, the data that you provided to them allows them to infer whether you prefer dragons or unicorns. And if that's not something they've decided to capture, they haven't asked anyone about dragons or unicorns, they are still going to be discriminating against you based on your dragon unicorn preference, but they're not even going to know that they're making that discrimination. They're not going to be able to tell you if you ask which one they think you prefer. It's something that happens entirely in the dark statistically. And so there are always going to be inferences made that they are unable to provide you with any information about and that you're unable to provide any feedback on. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Matthias, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Matthias, founder and executive director of Algorithm Watch. Francesco, I have a question for you. I didn't understand how that privacy-preserving model that you described would change anything about the optimization that the recommender is using, or the goal, the optimization goal that the recommender is using. It may, from what I understand, is that yes, it preserves privacy, but it doesn't, for example, change the fact that the recommender is optimizing for engagement. And if I may, Jesse, I have a question for you as well, and that is, you said that there is a new number of things that you could optimize for instead of engagement. I hope that's true. But here the question is, are you saying that if that is possible, either we need to regulate so that the platforms optimize for something else, or is there a business model for optimizing for something else that would outperform the business model for optimizing for engagement? Because otherwise I would suppose that platforms wouldn't use it.
You are definitely right. So this encryption will not solve the problem of what the model is optimizing. That was only solving the problem that the system will not know what are my personal data and can reuse this data for other purposes, like the one that he was mentioning before. But I think that the understanding what is the optimization of the system in terms of say what are the values that are trying to optimize, I think this is something that could be known now. So there could be an auditing with respect to that. So you can know what is the goal of the optimizer, while preserving the private data. I think it's very important and can only be achieved with this type of techniques.
Yeah, to answer your second question, briefly, I don't know. I think that this stuff is very early stage research and we really need to experiment with it further. I think that probably regulation is needed to get us there. I think in the long run, the interests could be aligned with the interests of the platforms. I don't think that the platforms are setting out to destroy democracy or anything like that. I think they want to be long-term successful businesses and that there is a path there. I think one of the major challenges of these other approaches is they usually mean you have to ask more of your users and create more friction. So if we look at GDPR banners that are not actually compliant and it's very easy to accept and it takes at least 2 or 3 clicks to say no, there's a low friction and there's a high friction path, and of course everybody takes the low friction path. So an engagement-based recommender system is always going to be very low friction. And so if we allow that as an option, it's going to be harder to get people to go over to the other side. At the same time, though, one of my colleagues at Mozilla, Bobby, she's doing some great work on friction in artificial intelligence. And I think there's a really interesting idea that if we have very low friction systems, they're leaving us kind of working in a very responsive kind of mode. The mindless scrolling, not thinking about what we're doing, because it's very low friction. And that if we want to preserve human autonomy, human dignity, we need to introduce friction into these systems so that we take more active roles in the content that we're consuming. And so this is an argument I'd like to be able to make for using these kind of other values in recommender systems. But at the same time, it's hard to imagine right now, how do we get people over there? And I don't know what else I can say.
Thanks a lot.
I wanted just to add one aspect that maybe is not clear. This idea that companies are optimizing user engagement is not completely true. You may think that they are doing this, but their ultimate goal is not the user engagement, is maintaining the users. So sometimes certain platforms understood that it's not the problem of giving, let's say, the best movie that you would like to consume now, but the problem is how to keep the subscription for 1 year and for 2 years. And this type of optimization is not based on engagement. So for instance, for music, if you keep, let's say, recommending the music that you like, typically what they observed is that the user are going out of the platform because then they don't need anymore the platform if their, let's say, music preferences are kept into a very, very small, let's say, group. They have to expand their preferences in order to keep the user engaged for a long-term engagement. So it's more complex what type of optimization they are doing, and they are typically, let's say, optimizing several criteria that maybe some are also contradictory between themselves.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Guilherme Migliora from Leiden University. I'm researching online hate speech and content moderation, and I have two questions. One is actually partially answered already about the platform's business models. I mean, I've seen throughout my research several examples of very harmful ways that certain contents were pushed, maybe not so much in Europe, but certainly in other areas of the globe. And it seems to me that the business model is always at the root. And then the question here, and for whoever in the panel that wants to address, do you think that like the changes that you discussed on the DSA might push into a different direction in either changing the business model or making that the business model is more aligned with what the users are looking for on the platform? And then the second question is for Kathy. I was in a different panel earlier today discussing how you could use a better language and kind of like a flat language to gather participation of civil society into algorithm process and etc. And you got me thinking on what you said that I mean we don't really care of the things that are online. We're just acting out of convenience. And I wonder if we start like adopting kind of like those more flat languages and kind of like something that it's like more palpable for the user, if that could help solve the problem. Thank you.
I think maybe Kati and Xabier are DSA experts on the panel, so maybe you want to take both of those questions.
Yeah, I have to think first. I am hesitant about if the DSA really helps with hate speech. So actually the platforms are already trying to solve that problem because, as already mentioned, platforms are not engaging for hate speech, but they, I know the discussions, but I would say it's not their prior goal to have hate speech on their platform, but the problem is that hate speech is connected to engagement because emotions are connected to engagement. And the problem we see in Germany, where we have the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, the NetzDG, what we actually see is that it's really difficult to decide on what hate speech actually is. And also, so there we need the national laws. And in Germany, for example, we have the problem that the national law doesn't know hate speech, and a lot of things which are actually hate speech are not understood as hate speech on the law. So I am hesitant that the DSA will change something here because we know the problem, we try to solve the problem, and we haven't solved the problem yet. So I don't think so. Then about your questions about the users want things to be convenient, I would say this is also one of the reasons why users use these platforms. Because they reduce complexity for us. And this is one of the many main goals. So yes, we need to address this problem, but I didn't understand exactly what your question was for what this could help. So maybe you can rephrase it again.
Yeah, earlier there was a panel on engagement of civil society organizations into the decision-making processes of AI systems, right? And one of the panelists was saying or for the developments of products by big tech. And one of the panelists was saying that the way they find to kind of like bring out bring those associations or like the public engagement was to better the communication of like kind of like making, for example, privacy concepts like more simple so that those people can engage more with that. And then my question is if you see a hole for that also in the way that platforms communicate with the users to kind of like maybe make convenience less default.
Yes, I really think so, but I guess we also have to take into account that there will always be a group of people we are not going to reach anyways. And I guess we always have to make the differentiation till when we can reach a specific group and when we have to say, okay, that's it's maybe not in the right time of their life, or maybe they have other things they have to concerns about or have to care about. So I guess we always feel like we need to reach everybody, and that's maybe the first step to realize that it's just not possible.
I do not have too much to add to what you already said. I just understand that it's possibly the problem here is that this is a multifaceted problem. So technology is just enhancing a human and a social problem, because the platforms, they want engagement because they need to survive, and to survive you need profits. And if you do something that is more privacy friendly but the others are not doing so, you are afraid that you will be kicked out of the market. So I think that in that sense regulation helps setting a level playing field, so everybody will have to comply with certain rules. But I think that it's really difficult when you consider things like trying to set the boundaries of which kind of goals are fair or could be legal for recommended systems. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a computer engineer, so I'm not so sure that we can regulate that certain business models are fairer than others. I mean, we can say that they are legal or not, but not so easily, oh, this is more fair than this other thing, so you should aim for this, so you should conduct your business in this way instead of another. But I have some hope, let's say.
Okay, so we have 4 more minutes and 2 more questions, and the last thing I want to do is to stand between you and your coffee. So maybe we can take the last 2 questions together, and yeah, keep it to a brief question each.
Hi, I'm Linda, also from Leiden University, and I think today the panel is really meaningful, the things we discussed. So my question is about Xabier's wish. I totally resonate that if we can have a panel that all the users can control their data and can show them what kind of data, maybe inferred data also included, so that user can have some kind of control. So I just want to ask all the panelists if you can share some thought. Do you think the current EU legislation, or also including the ones that are under discussion, maybe like AI Act, for example, the conformity assessment under the AI Act, if you're subject to if you're categorized at a high risk and you do the conformity assessment, and then maybe the standardization thing helps on this. Maybe you have a standardization on the users data control panel, those kind of similar thing. Yeah, so the EU legislation right now that we have, do you think that we are going to that direction? Yeah, thank you.
Baron Soka, Tech Freedom. I'd just like to know how you deal with the fact, or how you think we should deal with the fact that there are authoritarian and fascist elements that have their own ideas of what a healthy discourse would look like. And that, for example, the Italian courts have ordered Facebook to restore Casa Pound, a neo-fascist party. We know what Viktor Orban's idea of a healthy algorithm would look like. How do we deal with the potential for regulation to be abused by such actors?
Okay, so I think I know that Xabier has thoughts about the AI Act, so maybe I'm going to direct that question at you, and then the second question is up for grabs, but because we're running out of time, please keep it really brief.
Okay, shortly. Not all recommender systems are created equal. I mean, I'm generally very biased toward the regulator side, but we need to take into account that recommender systems are used by small e-commerce that sell a few thousand of shoes to a local, regional sphere, and are also used by big tech companies that have literally hundreds of millions of users. So legislation must match the risk for the users. So we cannot just say, okay, recommender systems are high risk and then they need to do this and that. On the other side, I mean, I don't see so much the conformity assessment as a tool to solve the issues that we were discussing here, because the AI Act is, in my view at least, is inheriting or coming a lot from the product legislation. So it's treating a lot AI systems like products. So I mean, and conformity assessments are like, okay, the checklist of the things that you should do to make sure that this does not explode, that this does not harm people. But of course, when it comes to fundamental rights, it becomes much more complicated. I think it's let's say well aimed, and it has some nice stuff on it. But I'm not sure that the AI Act is or the provisions in there could help recommender systems really being, let's say, less risky when they are, because not all of them are risky in terms of fundamental rights.
Just very briefly for the other question, I think that's why I like the idea of values-based recommending. I don't think there is anybody that I would trust to say what content should be allowed and should be disallowed, and I worry about authoritarian governments having that power. But I do think there are values around what healthy speech looks like that can be more universal, and we can have regulations that can make that possible across different sorts of regimes.
Well, we're 1 minute over time. I'll interpret that as punctual. But thank you so much for staying with us for a full 75 minutes. It's nice to see that no one fell asleep. So thank you and have a good Friday.